Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Israelis went to the polls today for the fourth time in 2 years, the fourth parliamentary election. Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu is the longest serving leader in Israel's history. He's facing multiple corruption charges and staying in office. Oh, what a surprise. Helps him avoid prosecution. Sounds familiar. Early polling suggests that Netanyahu's party, the Likud party, is the most popular political party in Israel and will get the most seats of any party. But it's not yet clear whether Netanyahu will be able to stitch together a coalition of, probably right-wing and then ultra-right-wing or ultra-Orthodox parties to control a majority of seats in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, and that would allow him to remain prime minister. Ben, I can't imagine going through 4 elections in 2 years. Is there anything you're watching in this race or like any reason you think to have hope that Bibi Netanyahu might finally exit the stage?
Well, the thing is that the Israeli public has been very constant in its political preferences. And, what people should always remember is the Likud will get the most votes of any party, but nowhere near 50%. But the problem is that the Likud party, is able to, because Israeli politics has moved to the right, is usually able to cobble together a coalition that gets you just above 60 in order to keep Netanyahu in power. And the reality here is that Netanyahu probably needs to stay in power to avoid prison. So the incentives are enormous for him to do whatever it takes. I think what's worrisome, he has said publicly in the run-up to this election that he prefers like a hard right government, like no centrist party that he has to rely upon. So you could be looking at in I think the worst case outcome, a uniformly far right Israeli government. The other 2 scenarios are maybe there's an upset and Lapid, who's like the leading opposition figure, is able to cobble together a really bizarre anti-Netanyahu coalition that is probably left, center, and some right, and is able to squeak through. Or a third scenario where Netanyahu can't just rely on right-wing votes, but somehow co-opts some part of the center. I think what's clear is that Israeli politics is paralyzed because of this question of Netanyahu. You either love him or hate him, and they just can't move forward psychologically. I think it'd be healthy, frankly, no matter what your political perspective is, to get beyond this one man. But we'll see today what his staying power is, and if the previous elections are an indication, he's probably the more likely person to be the next prime minister, but is not, for the 4th time, getting a mandate that clears this up, because not enough Israelis feel good about Netanyahu to put him in a comfort zone here. So we'll see.
It'll take a while to have some results for the elections. It could take even longer for the government formation process to proceed, upwards of maybe, I think, a month or so. So we'll stay on top of this one and keep our fingers crossed that, there might be a post-Netanyahu future for Israel in the same way we are really enjoying this post-Trump reality we're living in right now. Ben, let's talk about Biden's personnel for a minute. So President Biden nominated a guy named Colin Kahl to be his Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. You know Colin extremely well. That job that he's nominated for is the number 3 job at the Pentagon. It's a very influential position. Colin is indisputably qualified for this job. In fact, I think he's exceptionally well qualified. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He was the National Security Advisor to Joe Biden when Joe Biden was the vice president. He's had many other jobs. But Colin is facing resistance from Republican senators like Susan Collins, who said she is mad that Colin predicted that moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem could create a backlash. And Colin is also facing resistance from Joe Manchin, a Democratic senator from West Virginia, who is once again, policing old tweets by nominees the way he did with Neera Tanden. Now, Ben, I wouldn't call Colin Kahl some sort of lefty liberal. But you have a theory about why Colin might be facing resistance from members of the Senate and what you think the bigger implications of this fight are. Can you explain?
Yeah, so I don't think the tweets really come into play here. I mean, that's what they say the reason is, and that's what's got Joe Manchin's, whatever, social media police badge out. But if you look at his tweets, like these are not even anywhere near what Neera's were. These are like pretty commonly held views that any Democrat would express online. What's really been happening here is, Tom Cotton is whipping the opposition to this, and there's been a huge effort to cast Colin and right-wing media as anti-Israel. And what's at the core of it is Colin was among our most effective public advocates for the Iran nuclear deal in the Obama years. And then during the Trump years was one of the most effective critics of Trump's disastrous decision to pull out of the Iran deal. They're trying to get a scalp on the Iran deal here. And no mistake here, this is a really important job. This is kind of the job that drives the policy making of the Pentagon, right? The Secretary of Defense kind of looks over the field. The deputy often is focused on things like acquisition and personnel. This is the person who sits at the table in the sit room for a lot of discussions. And I think this is particularly gross for a number of reasons, right? Number one, if you tally up what Colin said online and certainly what he said about the Iran nuclear deal, he didn't say anything that isn't kind of a mainstream Democratic Party view, including, by the way, the views that Joe Biden himself expressed on the campaign, in part because Colin probably helped prepare him to express those views on the campaign. Yeah. And so they're essentially trying to disqualify someone for just having the views of the administration he used to work for, the Obama administration that did the Iran nuclear deal, and the person he works for who was his boss in the Obama years, right? The second thing, Colin and I were both spied on by Black Cube, the Israeli intelligence outfit that was hired by somebody. The Guardian suggested a Trump associate, who knows, but clearly someone who wanted to tear down me and Colin. And it said at the time, because of our work on the Iran deal. And this was particularly gross. A Black Cube operative reached out to Colin's wife and said she wanted to discuss organizing a fundraiser for his kids' preschool, right? I mean, this is the lengths that they were going to kind of somehow dig up dirt or intimidate a former public official, right? And you add this together, I mean, this man has been subjected to years of intimidation and disinformation campaigns online. And if you don't believe me, just consider a former Mossad operative reaching out to his wife and trying to organize a fundraiser for his kids' preschool. But also, importantly, he's being torn down because he's such an effective spokesperson for a policy that's unpopular on the right. And if the Biden team folds, if Joe Manchin folds on this thing, what is the message that's being sent? It's that you literally can't have appointees who are passionate and effective advocates for Democratic Party policies, or that you're essentially retroactively validating the kind of thuggish campaign that was waged against Colin for the last few years. That would be both a travesty for our national security, because we lose Colin, and frankly send a signal that we can't have anybody in confirmed jobs who can't pass essentially like a Republican test of whether or not they've been critical of Republicans in their history. And again, you're just validating this boorish behavior that Colin's been subjected to. So this is a big deal because, again, like, just imagine the kind of people who will be left pursuing these jobs. If even Colin Kahl, who you point out, he's not like a super progressive. Like Colin is a defense guy, So he's not like they're taking down the bomb throwing lefty here, or even me, right? This is a very mainstream thinker who just happened to be a passionate and effective advocate for the Iran deal.
I also like how these Republicans are trying to push that Colin was somehow anti-Israel, and then a bunch of like Israeli retired generals and national security officials came out and they're like, "What are you talking about? He had our backs all the time. He got us more funding for the Iron Dome missile defense project. He was meeting with us constantly. Like, he is someone who is well within the mainstream of like democratic national security thinking." And you're right. The message that bouncing him would send is that like Joe Biden can only hire Republicans to work at the Pentagon. Like, what is the argument here?
Or people who've said nothing critical of like the Trump policies or something. And look, the Israeli reaction was interesting because like not just U.S. national security people are vouching for Colin. Like, as you said, a lot of Israeli military leaders, because they know, you mentioned Iron Dome, Colin was there at the Pentagon in charge of this account when we ramped up this Iron Dome defense system that shoots down rockets coming from Gaza that saved countless Israeli lives. Like, so all these armchair pro-Israel, Republicans just weaponizing the old, you're insufficiently pro-Israel charge, like, they've done nothing. They can't, like, light a candle to what Colin Kahl's done for Israel's security. So it makes a mockery of that charge, too.
Well, hopefully Manchin stops with the tone policing and comes to his senses here. We can get Colin in soon because he is well qualified and we need him in that job. Ben, we've talked a couple times about vaccine equality and inequality, and I wanted to bring it up again because I was reading a piece in the New York Times, and this statistic jumped out at me about global COVID vaccination efforts. Of the vaccine doses given globally, roughly 3/4 have gone to only 10 countries. At least 30 countries have not injected a single person. The continent of Africa, which has 17% of the world's population, has so far administered roughly 2% of the vaccine doses. Kenya is hoping to inoculate 30% of its population by the middle of 2023. Not 2021, not 2022, 2023. So obviously, it didn't take the pandemic for us to understand the inequality between life in the US and life in Sudan, right? But the disparity in vaccination timelines for rich white countries like the US, the UK, Israel versus Kenya, a relative economic powerhouse, is shocking, and it's pretty outrageous. And to be clear, for those listening thinking, well, I just want to get a vaccine, I want my family to get vaccinated, this will hurt the US, right? The virus can mutate, it can come back, it can infect vaccinated people if it keeps changing and spreading. And these vaccination campaigns, if they're delayed, will literally cost the global economy trillions with a T of dollars. Some of the worst case estimates are up to 9 trillion. And a lot of that economic activity will hit developed countries because we're the ones, selling and buying stuff. So, Ben, all of us have been laser focused on, the U.S. distribution effort. The Biden administration is focused up on providing economic relief to, U.S. citizens who are hurting, to getting jabs and arms. But, knowing how hard it is to get people in America, especially Republicans, to support quote unquote foreign aid, when and how do you think the Biden team and the international community should ramp up efforts to help other countries get vaccinated? Because 2023 for a country like Kenya seems just outrageously far in the future to me, and something we can't allow to happen.
Yeah, I agree with everything you say. And look, I think what we've seen in this country is that the distribution of the vaccine, it's kind of like a math and logistics issue, right?
Yeah.
Once you have the vaccine created, when the Biden people came in and you had competent people willing to put resources behind it and just solve logistical problems, suddenly we're at 3 million doses within a couple months here. And so globally, this is just a math and logistics issue of our nation's going to be willing, richer nations, commit some resources to scale up additional vaccine or to use their surplus vaccine, to help reach places like Kenya? And will they work collaboratively and with the World Health Organization to have the logistics in place to get these vaccines out faster? Because, some parts of, rural Kenya, for instance, are just hard to reach, but you can do it if the will is there. And the cost is not eye-popping for this kind of thing. You're talking in the low tens of billions of dollars, I think, from some of the estimates I've seen. If you're pooling that among a bunch of rich countries and channeling in the WHO, and again, working with the pharmaceutical companies that have expressed some concerns, but kind of pushing them and saying, no, guys, this is a global health issue, this is a humanitarian issue. I think this is eminently doable, and the Biden team should prioritize this. And you mentioned the current pandemic and how you want to stamp it out and prevent strains from going. But clearly, we need a better global response mechanism anyway, because we're likely going to be dealing, experts say, with more frequent pandemics going forward, given climate change and other issues. And so wouldn't you want this kind of distribution network in place? Wouldn't you want the ability to scale up vaccines and disseminate it globally quickly? So there's all manner of moral and, frankly, kind of security and health reasons for us to be doing this.
Yes, agreed. I really hope we focus on this. I was glad we talked last week about the proposal to lift intellectual property rights that would allow other countries to freely manufacture some of these vaccines and treatments and testing and diagnostics. It seems like the obvious proposal. I'm glad people like Bernie Sanders, Jan Schakowsky have been pushing it.
One thing I just want to add, a friend of the pod, Samantha Power, has her confirmation hearing today.
Right now.
To run USAID. And this is a perfect person. Give Samantha this job because she is dogged and relentless, and she's good at building partnerships with other countries. So one of the things that I hope to see Samantha Power doing when she's confirmed at AID is this.
Yes, her voice will be heard on this issue and many others. Changing gears here, Ben, the Debate Me Coward Twitter trolling has gone global and has reached the head of the state level. So I'm talking about Russia and the U.S. because last week during an interview with ABC News, President Biden was asked whether he thought Russian President Vladimir Putin was a killer. Biden said, "I do." And he went on to say that Putin is going to pay for Russian interference in the 2020 election. This went over about as well as you'd expect in Moscow. Putin's response ranged from suggesting that Biden has dementia by saying, like, "I wish you good health, comrade, wink, wink," to pointing the finger back at Biden by saying, "It takes one to know one. No word yet if he who smelt it dealt it." So more seriously, Ben, Russia recalled its ambassador to Washington. They warned of irreversible deterioration of relations. It's always funny when, Russian officials who are cool with like annexing Crimea and murdering journalists and poisoning Alexei Navalny, right? They're offended by accurate descriptions of themselves. But whatever. Putin also challenged Biden to a debate, like a little Ben Shapiro move here. So our producer, Jordan Waller, reached out to our friend Alexei Kovalyov at Meduza News in Russia to get a sense of why Putin is leaning so hard into that fight. Let's listen to a clip of their conversation.
Putin has a very peculiar hierarchy of people he considers to be equal to him. So he doesn't respect sycophants and yes men because that's basically everyone around him, because he knows better than anyone how cheap they are, and that's really beneath his station to engage in a dialogue as equals. A lot of people have called Putin names over the years, but I don't think it's ever elicited such a heated reaction. Putin seems to have taken it quite close to heart. If he, chose to quite unceremoniously for him, really, to challenge a president of another country to a live debate. On the other hand, I don't think it's going to have like really far-fetching consequences for the U.S.-Russian relations, as bad as they are at the moment.
Alexei also noted that Russian state media, looks a lot like primetime Fox News these days. They're looping video of Biden tripping when he was walking up the stairs. They're accusing him of having dementia. Again, everyone should check out Meduza News. They do like really impressive investigative reporting out of Russia, which is not the safest job in the world. So thank you to them. So Ben, on the one hand, Putin is a killer. That's just a fact. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. On the other hand, he's a thin-skinned, whiny little killer. And this war of words might make him more difficult to work with or give him a pretext to worsen relations. Are you worried about this latest controversy? Should we be more worried about the sanctions that the U.S. just put on Russia? Like, how are you viewing this one?
No, I think this was performative by Putin. I mean, just consider this, Tommy. Like, this is the first time they've recalled an ambassador since the 1990s, before Putin, when the U.S. bombed Iraq. Now, consider everything that's happened since the invasion of Crimea and Ukraine, U.S. sanctions, U.S. pulling out of all kinds of arms control treaties, backs and forth across the board. This tells me that I don't think Joe Biden calling Putin a killer is like the most consequential event that's happened in the 21st century, right? So part of this, I think, is Putin just kind of performing, trying to brush back Biden, trying to gin up his kind of nationalist media machine at home, kind of trolling Biden a little bit with some of the same content on their state media, as you said, that's on Fox. I should point out that some of the conspiracy theories actually started first in Russian disinformation campaigns and then made its way to Fox. But I also think that it demonstrates like a real vulnerability of Putin. He seems to be much more thin-skinned about criticism of anything inside of Russia than what he does outside of Russia. It's like we could say whatever we want about what he's doing in Ukraine or what he did in Syria, and he would never respond like this. But once you start to talk about what he does in Russia, and Biden, I think, was referring to, he's a killer because he's killed opponents, he goes apoplectic in the same way that Navalny drives him apoplectic. And this is a guy, I think, that doesn't feel like he's on as firm political footing as he probably did a decade ago because of what Navalny's done, because of corruption, because the system is atrophied, because it's increasingly clear that he is a killer who's silenced critics around the world. So I think it sets up an interesting dynamic where the Biden people have to judge how often are they hitting this funny bone, if you will, this nerve spot around issuing more direct criticism of his domestic policies and domestic approaches. Look, at the end of the day, the U.S. and Russia like are accustomed to having huge fights about some things and working together on others. Like at the absolute rock bottom of U.S.-Russian relations after the invasion of Ukraine and at the height of the Syrian civil war, they did the Iran nuclear deal with us. So it's possible to walk and chew gum here. But I think the space to watch again is how much the Biden people focus in on Putin's domestic political vulnerabilities, his corruption, and how does Putin respond to this. The debate. The only other thing I noticed, Tommy, is do you see all those Republicans like kind of taking Putin's side in the debate?
They love it. They love, the right wing loves to jump on board the Putin train and pretend that he's tough and criticize Biden for not debating him. It's so pathetic. It's so pathetic. Yeah. Look, also I know that like recalling your ambassador is a big deal, but didn't it just seem kind of like petulant and weak? It just seems kind of pathetic to me.
Well, yeah. I mean, I know we're going to talk about China later too, but like,
yeah, similar dynamic there.
Yeah, Russia and China, like, if you're so strong, why are you so sensitive about pretty routinized criticism? Like it's actually not unlike Colin Kahl's tweets, like, an American thinking that Putin's a killer or criticizing Chinese human rights. Like there's a sensitivity here that doesn't feel like strength to me.
No.
And, and I was just going to say about the Republicans, like, part of this is just trolling Democrats, but part of it's like Putin is, he's anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT, kind of white, patriarchal, embraces the Russian Orthodox Church. Like there's a lot more in common. This isn't just an alliance of convenience. Like Republicans look at Putin and find more to agree with than with Joe Biden.
Oh, but Putin would do better in Iowa than Mike Pompeo.
Yeah. And that tells you, we're pretty far away from Ronald Reagan evil empire here.
Yeah, we're not tearing down that wall anymore. You mentioned China, so let's just jump to that. So on Monday, the U.S., Canada, the U.K., and the European Union announced sanctions on Chinese officials believed to be connected to the ongoing genocidal campaign about the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China. And for years now, we've talked about this many times, the Chinese government has been building massive concentration camps to imprison an estimated 1 million or more Uyghurs in Western China. The Chinese government says this is about fighting terrorism. These are re-education camps. Like that's their best case, right? But the reality is truly horrific. Many Uyghurs have been tortured. Women have been raped. They've been forced to work in factories. It's the worst thing you could imagine. It's a genocidal crime against humanity. The U.S. sanctions target two specific individuals. One leads the Xinjiang Province Production and Construction Corps. The other leads the Xinjiang Public Security Program. That Xinjiang is the part of China where this is happening. The sanctions announcement comes after a tense meeting between a U.S. delegation led by Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and their Chinese counterparts last week in Alaska. Politico's Nahal Tusi, broke the story about the sanctions and reported that the EU sanctions on China over the Uyghurs were believed to be the first sanctions from Europe against China since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. So that does speak to the significance. Yeah. Ben, so this kind of like coordinated action by the U.S. and allies has been sort of the approach you've been talking about for a while. We've been talking about it in the show. The U.S. has also announced sanctions on 24 officials linked to China's effort to destroy democracy in Hong Kong. Do you have any thoughts on this sanctions announcement, whether it was a good idea or not, and more broadly on that like testy exchange between Tony, Jake, and this Chinese delegation and what it might say about the future of U.S.-China relations?
So I think this is a really welcome step. And, part of what's happened in the past is that China is very good at bullying individual countries. And so individual countries are kind of afraid to speak out against Chinese human rights abuses because if one European country does it, they get smacked down by the Chinese and they suffer, a trade reprisal action or something. And part of what we've talked about on this podcast, and I, frankly, spent the last few years talking a lot to people like Jake and Tony about this, is can the U.S. join hands with other countries, with the EU, with Canada, hopefully, with some Asian allies, Australia, Japan, others, so that suddenly it's 50% of the global economy raising their voice together, not just the U.S. from our own narrow perspective, or not just Europe, not just obviously a country like Canada that's smaller and more vulnerable. And so their capacity to line up, most of the democratic, small d democratic world to do this, I think is a powerful signal that China's going to get some long-deserved scrutiny on its human rights record. The exchange, similarly in Alaska, part of what was interesting to me is that the Biden people put some of these sanctions on, like leading into that summit.
Yeah.
And that's what provoked the Chinese, because normally you try to kind of keep the deck pretty clear. You're not doing Taiwan arms sales and you're not sanctioning Chinese officials like in the run up to your summit. But the Biden people, I think, are sending a very interesting message of like, guys, no more constraints here. Like, what you've done on Xinjiang province with the Uighurs, what you're doing in Hong Kong, the degree to which you're pushing people around, we're just going to push back, and you're just going to have to get accustomed to that. And I think the Chinese outburst was, intended to kind of signal their displeasure at that, maybe brush the Biden people back, but also, in fairness to the Chinese, say like, we don't care if you push us back, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And it sets up a pretty scratchy dynamic for U.S.-China relations going forward, but I think necessary. And the one comment we'll be unpacking for the next year, this question of like, how do you balance getting firmer on issues like human rights with not wanting to get into a Cold War? It's not a binary choice between like looking the other way on Xinjiang province and Hong Kong and being in a full-blown Cold War. Like, I support a really aggressive multilateral effort to spotlight Chinese human rights abuses. I support the Biden team, pointing to China and saying, hey, we got to invest in infrastructure. We got to invest in R&D because they're out competing us. I support, even efforts to kind of work multilaterally on issues like the South China Sea to say, hey, we're going to be speaking together with some other countries here. You guys can't just go and kind of claim a whole body of water for yourself. We're going to try to force this into some international process. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use China to justify $1 trillion defense budget and to saber rattle and risk a conflict. There's ways of being tougher, quote unquote tougher, although I think that word is drained of meaning in national security, but certainly more confident about your values, and more confident in trying to lead fellow democracies in advocating for human rights, without falling into a Cold War, and while acknowledging, as the Biden people did, like, hey, we know we're in a glass house. The best thing we can do for democracy is fix it at home. We get that, but that doesn't mean we're going to be silent about Hong Kong.
Yeah, and like to further this sort of can you walk and chew gum, can you fight and talk point, I saw that John Kerry, the U.S. Climate envoy, is meeting with his Chinese counterpart at a virtual conference on climate change today, Tuesday. This conference is in preparation for another, still virtual, global climate summit on April 22nd, where Biden is expected to roll out new climate goals and targets, and then also have a virtual meeting with Xi Jinping, the president of China. So, it's interesting that we are having these blow-ups, but the U.S. is also asking the Chinese to commit to stronger CO2 reductions like the same month.
Yeah, I think the dynamic you want is that we are working collaboratively with China on climate. We are trying to work together to deal with this crisis for humanity. We're working, by the way, hopefully collaboratively with China on global health and vaccine dissemination and things like that, while having like very vigorous debates, arguments, fights, not military ones, but diplomatic ones about these other issues, and I think that's fine. The world should understand what happened in Anchorage, where basically Tony and Jake gave opening statements for like a couple minutes, and then the Chinese guy went off for like 20 minutes, and then Tony called back in the press so he could make another statement from the press. This may have looked kind of boring, like a horseshoe-shaped table in a room and some reporters. It's the analogy for sports fans of like during the warm-ups where they're introducing the teams, like one guy just going over and punching some guy in the face, and the other team. In diplomacy, this was like WrestleMania, 100.
This was Malice at the Palace. Tony Blinken was Meta World Peace. He was up in the stand. No, too. Like we used to joke back in the Obama White House that like we would call a meeting a Chinese bilat when it just felt like everyone literally had scripted talking points that they were going to read going in. There were no surprises. There were no conversations. For this to turn into like a verbal boxing match was pretty remarkable.
And I'll say this for the Chinese perspective of the Chinese foreign minister who like went off on the U.S. and went off on our racism, and fine, let's just kind of have the debate, right? Like to people who are worried about this, I actually found it healthy because usually you meet the Chinese and you don't, you dance around stuff, and they dance around stuff too. Like they probably believe every word that the foreign minister said, and a lot of what he said, is true, even if he torqued it up. We obviously believe a lot of things about Hong Kong and Xinjiang province and the Chinese kind of totalitarian model they're building. Why not have debates in public? Like I thought that was, in a way, even if it was diplomatically, off-putting, I think it was useful, and I think that Tony and Jake did the right thing in getting a last word in there.
Yeah, credit to them. It was not going to be a pleasant meeting with unpleasant topics, but the alternative is doing what Trump did, which is tell Xi Jinping that building concentration camps for the Uyghurs is the right thing to do, and just literally not caring as the Hong Kong democracy is being smothered. So, good for those guys for having a very uncomfortable meeting in front of a bunch of reporters. Ben, let's turn to the UK for a minute, because last week we talked about protests and vigils against gender-based violence in the UK and the murder by a police officer of a woman named Sarah Everard. Over the weekend, there were even more protests across Britain about a bill in the British Parliament that would create harsher penalties for certain crimes and would give police more authority to break up and criminalize protests. This bill would include penalties of up to 10 years in prison for individuals who damage memorials or statues. And I don't think it was lost on anyone that over the summer, a statue of a literal slave trader was ripped down in Bristol and thrown into Bristol Harbor, which was fucking awesome. But this bill seems to be a response to that. And it reminds all of us, I think, of Trump's executive order in defense of Confederate monuments that should also get torn down. Friend of the pod, David Lammy, has been forcefully calling bullshit on this bill and the fact that Parliament seems far more interested and willing to criminalize protesters than to protect British citizens, especially women, from violence. This bill will now go to a committee, then the House of Commons. If you want to read more, check out David Lammy's Twitter feed. There's been lots of great coverage in the BBC and other places. Ben, is canceling protests technically defined as part of cancel culture, or does that only apply to stupid debates around children's books? How should we view this?
Well, I think what's interesting to me about this, and I've talked to David Lammy about this, is British politics and American politics tend to be mirror images of each other, and when the right wing attacks on defund the police and cancel culture picked up here over the summer, they began to pick up there. But also what usually happens in our right-wing politics kind of slowly goes global too. Sometimes not so slowly. And sometimes we're on the receiving end of that, and sometimes we're the distributor. I say that to make the point that cancel culture, I apologize to people in other countries, it's going to be a thing everywhere. Every right-wing leader in any Western democracy is going to be starting to trot out the statue defense, and that's kind of depressing. I think it also means, though, that we, people on the progressive end, even center left, Labor Party and Democrats and others across the democratic world, need to share ideas about how do you push back on cancel culture BS? How do you protect basic rights like protests? We have a stake in this debate in Britain, just as they have a stake in us not going totally insane and Trumpy in the last election. Because I think we're in an era now where this kind of cancel culture thing is the next phase of the global culture war.
It is exhausting. It is exhausting. It is constant. And I think we as liberals and we as progressives look at it, think it's stupid. We're right that it's stupid. But unfortunately, there's a bunch of polling data that shows that this cancel culture fight might be the way Republicans are able to reach younger voters. And so I do think we need to think through ways to talk about it that are just, smarter, better able to undercut Republican arguments, which are usually in bad faith. But I hate that this is what we talk about. It sucks.
Well, and I think, though, it's a good reminder, as with our politics here, I always forget how conservative England is, because most people I know, maybe everybody I know, and I know a lot of Brits, would think that this bill is ridiculous, but they also tend to think Boris Johnson's ridiculous. And again, it's such a London prism that foreigners have of the UK. You have to remember that it's the Tories have run that place with the exception of Tony Blair, who wasn't exactly a huge progressive, and briefly Gordon Brown, for the better part of the last few decades. And you have to convince some of those people, just as that the Democratic Party has to somehow both keep our base energized and mobilized and appeal to some people who disagree with us. The British Labour Party, if they want to come in from the wilderness under Keir Starmer, their relatively new leader, are going to have to figure out how to do both, how to hold together the left and appeal to some of these people that have, are somewhat susceptible to these cancel culture arguments.
Yeah, and do so under the decrepit racist thumb of Rupert Murdoch, which makes it all that much harder. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of rare, hopeful news out of Yemen. Earlier this week, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister proposed a peace plan to end the war in Yemen after 6 long, awful years. This plan recommends a ceasefire that would be overseen by the United Nations. It recommends political negotiations and then the reopening of ports and airports that could hopefully be used to allow humanitarian relief into Yemen. This fighting started back in 2014 when the Houthi rebels seized control of much of western Yemen. Saudi Arabia then cobbled together a coalition to try to take that territory back. The Saudi coalition was initially backed by the U.S., by President Obama. Obama pulled back that support, but then when Trump took office, he doubled down on supporting the Saudis. And the result was a estimated 20 million people in Yemen on the edge of starvation and in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. Ben, this isn't the first attempt at a ceasefire in Yemen. It is the first with President Biden's renewed focus on the problem, and it's the first after his decision to cut off U.S. support for offensive Saudi operations in this fighting. How hopeful are you about this iteration of a peace plan might work?
I mean, I'm glad they're doing something. I hope it works out. I do want to see kind of what the follow through is here. I mean, because here's the basic problem, right? The Saudis are not going to accomplish what their objective was when they went to war, which is kind of wipe out Houthi influence. And the Houthis, by the way, are not going to accomplish their maximalist objectives of conquering the capital city. And so whenever you're trying to enter a diplomatic negotiation where both sides are going to in some way lose, it's very challenging. I think that the overwhelming focus, though, has to be on ceasefire and humanitarian access. Just getting help to people as fast as possible while you're resolving these political issues. And in that context, the U.S. saying, we will provide no support to any military operations, offensive, frankly, or, defensive. I'm curious. I'm always curious for how they define that.
Missile defense or something? I'm not
Missile
sure,
defense is fine, right? But defensive, the Saudis probably might argue that bombing some target in Yemen is a defensive measure, right? So my point is, if we truly pull the plug, they can't really sustain their operations either. So hopefully the combination of if you can get a ceasefire, and start to get aid in on the ground, and the U.S. just saying, we're out. We're totally out. We've unplugged from anything the Saudis are going to do in the territory of Yemen, period. Then I think you have some real hope. The political questions may drag on. What the political future of Yemen looks like may drag on. But if you can just get to a place where you're stopping the bombardment and you're saving lives again with the assistance, again, another priority, I'm sure, for Samantha Power, at least you're in an improved situation, but We'll see.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the initial Houthi response wasn't all that positive, but we'll keep an eye on this one.
And by the way, the Iranians, I mean, we usually
right.
I'm going to be very clear here. Like the Iranians too, should recognize the interest in this process as well. Although I don't think that they control the Houthis as a proxy as much as people think. The Houthis live in Yemen. They've always lived in Yemen.
Right. I agree with that. Let's turn to South America and talk about Joe Biden and drug policy. So I was reading about how Colombia is planning to restart a program of spraying toxic chemicals on cocoa crops in an effort to reduce cocaine production. And Colombia is doing so with the support of the Biden administration. Colombia had stopped this spraying program because of concerns that the chemical being sprayed, which is the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, causes cancer, causes other harmful health problems, kills off other flora and fauna, and just really harms people who are living there. Critics also argue that these spraying programs disproportionately hurt small farmers who are trying to eke out a living, growing whatever crop they can, rather than targeting the labs where cocaine is processed or going after cartels themselves. The spraying is also just generally considered expensive and ineffective. So Trump had pushed Colombia to resume this spraying program, but now the Biden team seems to support it. Ben, I was reading about how this is also initially part of Plan Colombia, which is this multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar effort to fight against cocaine production in Colombia and to combat the rebel group there called the FARC. But interestingly, part of the peace agreement with the FARC in 2016 included an agreement to stop spraying these crops. So it seems like resuming this activity could screw up that peace deal. Spraying programs like this have been used in a lot of other places, right? Like quite controversially in Afghanistan. You could go back to Agent Orange. I don't know a lot about the details of these programs, but like in the research I did on this, I didn't see a single person say, yeah, this is a great idea. This is a really effective way to, combat drugs. Why do you think President Biden supports these sort of counter-drug spraying programs? And could it be the case that just drug policy generally is an area where he is a little more conservative than, sort of maybe the consensus Democratic view?
Yeah, I just think of the places you've referenced, Colombia, Afghanistan, these spraying programs don't work, like among many other things. And part of what happened, I got involved, Tommy, in the negotiation of that peace agreement in Colombia in 2016 because it was negotiated in Havana. The Cubans were involved with the FARC. And part of what happened here is, when you go from kind of fighting a war and contesting certain parts of the country to peace, you started seeing more cocoa production. And because of the dynamics of the drug trade, some of the intensity shifted back to Colombia. And so why does this happen? I think because, politicians are looking at graphs and seeing, cocaine exports from Colombia going up. And it's like, what's our solution? Oh, we'll do the spraying program. Right. It's a lack of other options. Right. It's like, it's that impulse that you remember from working in national security, like, let's do something, right? It's why you always end up sanctioning people. Like, what do we do when there's more drugs? We should spray them. But the problem is the spraying programs are part of a war on drugs mindset that has utterly failed in every way, shape, and form. It's punished the wrong populations often in this case could punish farmers and local communities. It hasn't stopped the sale. When people want drugs, they figure out ways to get them. So I think Biden may be falling prey here to the briefing with the graph on it that shows the cocaine production going up, and this is what is being presented as the only thing to do. I think what we need in the Americas is a real conversation about drug policy and legalization, candidly. And maybe I don't necessarily think that means legalizing cocaine, but marijuana, more and more countries are moving in that direction. What does a multifaceted policy look like that involves, maybe you're trying to crack down on certain crops, but you're trying to separate out drugs that are being legalized and regulated versus drugs that are still funneling through cartels. By the way, what you hear time and again from people south of our border is it's American demand and American guns that fuel this whole thing, right? It's the American drug users who drive up the price. And if marijuana is legalized, that at least takes that off the table, or somewhat off the table because you obviously still have cocaine and heroin and stuff. But then also, unregulated guns, what do you think the cartels are killing each other with? So we need a kind of a broad, comprehensive conversation in the Americas about drug policy, and we need to move beyond just the spray it or have it funneled through the cartels approach.
Yeah, it felt very dated. Let's keep talking about Biden and drugs for a minute, because the Daily Beast reported that dozens of staffers who I guess worked on maybe the Biden campaign and wanted to work in the White House have been prevented from doing so because of their personal recent marijuana use. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, our very good friend, released a statement saying that only 5 White House staffers actually lost jobs because of this sort of no tolerance policy seemingly on marijuana. I don't know the specifics of these individual cases. It could be the case that people were misleading on their forms. It could have been very recent drug use. I don't know. I'm not judging the Biden aspect of this. But more broadly, I don't understand, Ben, why marijuana use is part of the SF-86, which is the form that we all had to fill out, the government questionnaire and background check process that you have to go through to get a security clearance. So more than a dozen states have legalized marijuana. Dozens more have legalized medical marijuana. The suggestion that smoking marijuana or taking an edible or something you can buy in a store here in California, doing that on occasion means you can't be trusted with national security information is fucking ludicrous. It's like a scene out of Reefer Madness from another time, right? That is no different than having a beer at night or a glass of wine. Why do you think the intelligence community wastes its time looking into these drug use questions? Is this just inertia? How is this the process that we've decided protects national security information? Something, by the way, the intelligence community has really struggled to do in recent years for very different reasons.
I think this is insane and absurd and offensive and actually important. I'm not just saying that because, like, I don't know if I'm adding anybody here, but like the entire crooked media family of former Obama staff, like, you probably had this on our forms and got our clearances.
Oh, absolutely.
I
Yes.
mean, I was the deputy national security advisor with a top secret, secure, compartmented information clearance, and I smoked marijuana and put it down on my form. So I was, look, I love Jen Psaki like a sister. I was a little mystified by her statement that they had changed the policies to make them more liberal, because I don't remember anybody getting fired in our White House for marijuana use. But put that aside, there's the issue of legality, which is absurd, because I can walk out the door and make a left on Abbot Kinney and walk into MedMen and buy drugs and use them perfectly legally on the street in my home. And you're telling me that because I undertook legal behavior, that if I got a job in the White House, I'd get fired because I did that? Like a good chunk of the country, not most yet, but I think a good chunk live in states where this is legal. And so you're essentially saying you're going to disqualify people from White House or national security jobs for engaging in legal behavior where they live? That just is not fair, right? The second thing is, you're thinking about national security, like, it used to be that one of the main things you're looking for in that clearance is blackmail, right? Could you be blackmailed, right? And so it used to be like drug use was such a taboo that like you wouldn't want someone to know that you used to use drugs. Well, now it's not taboo at all, in part because it's legal in a lot of places. And yeah, the idea that like, honestly, as someone who's done both, drinking feels much more relevant here. Like whether someone is out drunk and approached by foreign intelligence operatives who take advantage of them being very drunk, that feels like a bigger risk than someone sitting at home, watching whatever on Netflix and having an edible. It just doesn't make any sense. So
No, it really doesn't.
And they're human beings here. But this gets to why it's important. And it gets to your question. Some of this is like cultural sorting out. Like, some of the people went into national security and law enforcement didn't like the people who did drugs in college or something. And I'm not assigning that huge motivation, but I think part of it's bureaucratic inertia. But this connects to the Colin Kahl discussion. Just think of the message that's being sent. If we say our national security establishment, the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence community, we don't want anybody who expresses views like Colin Kahl's about issues, i.e. views that are like pretty mainstream progressive. We don't want anybody who's ever used marijuana. Like, who is left, right? A very particular kind of person. And I like a lot of those people. But don't we want quote unquote diversity in national security workforce? And diversity should mean absolutely racial and ethnic diversity and gender diversity, but it should also mean like different kinds of people, And again, just think who you're sorting out if you say nobody who's used marijuana can work in these jobs.
Yeah, you're like, to your point, I believe, what was it, Carter Page? Which one of the dumb Trump morons got drunk and told the Australians that the Trump campaign had found Hillary's emails, right?
So Papadopoulos, right?
Yeah, Papadopoulos, thank you. I forgot which moron it was, right? So clearly alcohol was a factor there that made him not trustworthy with national security sensitive information. But to the broader point about the clearance process, it's not clear in any way. There's no clear expectation going in about what the benchmarks you have to meet are, right? Like, you can't go to the intelligence community website where it says you can't have smoked marijuana for 3 years, right? That's because it's not uniform off among different components of the intelligence community. Like, the FBI has like sort of well known for having the strictest rules when it comes to drug use. The CIA, maybe because CIA operatives traffic in some darker places, have a little less strict rules. Members of the intelligence community have to take a polygraph. You and I did not have to take a polygraph, a lie detector test, right? Yeah. Like these policies are all over the place, and I don't know. Certainly, they've like served a lot of people well and led to them protecting national security information, but there also have been massive, unbelievable, historically damaging leaks of the crown jewels of the NSA and WikiLeaks and all these other Snowden, all these pieces of information that have clearly nothing to do with whether like Edward Snowden took an edible and played like World of Warcraft for a couple hours. It's ridiculous.
I think the whole thing should be scrapped. I mean, certainly the marijuana thing, but this whole clearance process needs to be rethought of what are you guarding against? What are you protecting against? Let me add another. Andy Kim, friend of mine, congressman from New Jersey, had an amazing thread about he's of Korean origin, and when he worked at State, they told him he wasn't allowed to work on issues related to Korea.
Really?
And he's like, yeah, and he writes a great thread on Twitter. People should check it out of how painful that was to him. That he's a Korean American, and they basically were like, well, you can't work on this issue. Trust me, they don't tell Tom Malinowski, who's of Polish origin, who's a member of Congress, also from New Jersey, that he can't work on Polish issues, right? And he was making the point about racial profiling. At the end of the day, like, we want people from all backgrounds to be participating because it's right. It's the right thing to do. And I think it's like the right thing to do that you don't punish people for engaging in legal behavior with marijuana, but you also want diverse perspectives on these issues. Why do you think there's such groupthink in American national security? Like the blob, the term that I'm both famous and derided for coining, is about groupthink. I want people of different life experiences, different ethnic backgrounds. America should have a great asset in being this big, sprawling country with people from everywhere, with all different kinds of life experiences. And if we kind of force self-censorship of opinion because of the Colin Kahl stuff, and we force self-censorship of behavior, the only people capable of being in these jobs are people who like set out to be in them from the time they were like 13 years old. And that's crazy.
Yeah. Come on. Let's normalize, a couple of visits to a festival or something in your life. Live a little, for fuck's sake.
Live a little.
Two more quick things. So let's start in Myanmar. Two updates out of Myanmar. The first is just horrible. A refugee camp in Bangladesh for the Rohingya, a Muslim ethnic minority group that was terrorized and driven out of Myanmar, estimates of up to 700,000 people. This refugee camp, where they've all been, living temporarily now for years in Bangladesh, basically burned to the ground this week. Dozens are dead, hundreds are missing. The scale of the suffering for the Rohingya is just unfathomable, and so we'll keep an eye out for any kind of humanitarian relief efforts or places people can donate to because they need the help. Second, Ben, on Friday of last week, the House of Representatives voted on a piece of legislation condemning the military coup in Myanmar. Now, obviously, this is a symbolic vote, but symbolism matters in foreign policy. 14 Republicans voted against the bill. 14 Republicans voted against condemning a military coup. The infamous racist lunatic Paul Gosar of Arizona voted present. The 14 Republican no votes are the worst of the worst people in the GOP, or I guess really the country. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren
the world.
Gilbert,
I'd say the world.
The world. Yeah. Matt Gaetz. What the fuck, man? Like, what do you think motivated this? Like, did they view this as some sort of oblique shot at Trump since he attempted to stage a coup in the Capitol on January 6th?
I think it's the only way you can explain that collection of people voting this way. And you saw, the military in Myanmar said that there was election fraud. And when the commission that had to make a determination about that didn't side with them, they launched a coup. And Matt Gaetz and all these armchair neo-fascist Republicans clearly looked at that and saw something to validate, or else why else would they vote this way? Or why else would you be pro-coup? They're shooting young people in the streets, and this is how these people vote. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. And the one thing I'd say about the Rohingya, Tommy, is and talking to some activists too, is now's the time. One other thing the Biden people could do if they're looking for tools is international justice, and the ICC, when you're talking about the military and what was done to the Rohingya, but also what they're doing now in the coup. We've had a complicated relationship with the ICC, but referring this kind of thing for investigation, sending a message that the U.S. is going to support international justice for these people, for what they did to the Rohingya and what they're doing now, I think should be something the Biden administration takes a look at least.
It's a good idea. Last thing before we get to my interview, since I am, have the privilege of sitting with America's premier royal correspondent, I just read today that Prince Harry got a job. He will be the chief impact officer at a startup called Better Up Inc. The Wall Street Journal described the company as a coaching and a mental health firm. I don't, like with most tech companies, even Harry's description of what he'll be doing didn't totally make sense to me. Maybe he'll figure out as he goes along. Obviously, mental health is a critical issue generally, it's an important issue for him. He's been outspoken and honest about it, and like really a credit to him. But Ben, question for you. I did not know that Harry was looking for a job. Did you know this, and did we miss a chance to get him to Crooked Media? Could he have been a third co-host, or are we too liberal?
Royal correspondent. He could have been the royal correspondent. I will say BetterUp sounds like I'd never heard of BetterUp.com, and it sounds like something they would advertise during a podcast.
It does.
So maybe he could do ad reads.
Yeah. Maybe it's how we maybe it's a better way to expense your receipts, or maybe it's illegal marijuana.
Well, that helps with mental health. I mean, I would say that what it tells me is like the guy is like, I mean, he's all in on his U.S. life post Royals, you know what I mean? Like he's got his Netflix thing. The Netflix thing is like, that's one thing he could do, but clearly he's looking to have a diverse source of income here, and it's California based. Like, Harry is definitely out.
Yeah,
and he's definitely, better up for him.
Yeah, the boats were burned long before the Oprah interview for Harry. It seems like he is very cool with this choice here. Yeah. I don't know, Harry, come on the show. We'd love to talk to you. We can talk about literally anything you want.
Anything.
I don't really give a shit about what your family is up to. Like, we'll talk about your time in Afghanistan or the charity work you're doing. I don't know. I'd love to have Amal Clooney on the show to talk about what it means to be like an international humanitarian human rights attorney. I do not give a shit about your marriage, your husband's movies, Hollywood. It would just be really cool to hear about how like citizen lawyers can help advance foreign policy. That's very interesting to me.
Well, I've told you that my Amal Clooney stories are like, I met with her when she was working for the UN rapporteur on drones at the White House.
I bet. That was probably fun for you.
It was not fun. Amal Clooney's a good lawyer and grilled my ass for an hour about drone policy. This is like right before I guess they started dating, and then I saw that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I've talked to her about she takes up interesting human rights cases, like the Filipino journalist Ria Ressa. I talked to her about that case. Yeah, we should have her on. Harry, come on, talk about Better Up. We're game.
Thanks in advance to Amal Clooney and Prince Harry for their future interviews. Thanks to MedMen for their impending sponsorship, for all the PR we gave you today. Anyone else we need to thank, Ben?
No, that's a pretty eclectic list of people and things.
Yeah, that's our Avengers squad. All right,
life in LA in a pandemic is what it is.
Yeah, right. It's been a long year, guys. It's been a long year. Talk to you next week.